This is the fifth video in the Building Outdoor Communities Outdoor Economic Toolkit series. It's looking at the chapters from the Loomis and Walsh Recreation Economic Decisions book. And your narrator is John Whitehead. And we are covering the contingent valuation method in this video. And as you can see, we're getting there. This is the fifth video. We have two more to go after this. So if you are out there, you're almost done. Okay, so the pages that I'm covering in chapter 10 are pages 159 to 168. And we're looking at something called the contingent valuation method, which is what's called a survey-based approach that directly elicits willingness to pay for recreation. Okay, so what we're going to be trying to do with this contingent valuation method is estimate the value, the economic value of a recreation trip. And what you do is you ask survey participants hypothetical questions about their recreation behavior. And then because we are asking hypotheticals, we need to worry about the accuracy of these statements. Okay, so there are 6 basic characteristics of this approach to economic valuation. There are rules to the hypothetical market. There's a description of the resource to be valued. There is a valuation measure, and then a time frame for the valuation responses. That means whether it's we're looking at an annual value or a daily value or a monthly value. Okay, then there is a method of payment and question format. And so we'll cover each of these. Okay, so in terms of hypothetical market rules, there is a complex type of contingent valuation where you estimate the value of environmental quality. And then there's a more simple one that can be used to estimate the value of recreation behavior. And so we'll be using the simple one, so we don't have a lot of hypothetical market rules, but we do need to provide a description of whatever institution that we're using that describes the proposed transaction. Okay, and so those rules should be described in enough detail so that the survey respondent understands the situation. And these rules need to be realistic and credible, as familiar to the survey respondent as possible, and it needs to be perceived as fair and equitable. And I know that sounds a little bit vague right now, but we'll look at some examples in a few minutes. Okay, in terms of the description of the resource to be valued, the recreation activities that are being proposed should be described, or their quantity, quality, time, and location should all be described. And then if there's any hypothetical situation that goes beyond the status quo, that needs to be described and be plausible. Okay, there's no point in asking questions that are implausible, because all you're going to get is some implausible answers. Okay, the valuation measure, we're going to ask people for their willingness to pay, and these willingness to pay statements can be used to estimate willingness to pay for a recreation trip, which is equivalent for our purposes with the consumer surplus of the trip that comes from the travel cost method. Okay, so we use willingness to pay because survey respondents are familiar with paying money for goods and services. Okay, every day we engage in consumer transactions, and so paying more money for something will make sense. Okay, in terms of the time frame, okay, it's pretty realistic for survey respondents to be asked about their most recent trip, which is the approach that we'll take. So typically in a recreation survey, respondents are asked to value changes in recreational activities per day or per trip. And then combined with an estimate of the number of days or recreation trips that are taken, okay, the product of those two numbers can be used to estimate seasonal or annual recreation values. Okay, the method of payment needs to make sense. And the jargon in the contingent valuation literature is, this is the payment vehicle. Okay, so it should be selected to elicit honest answers. Okay, so an increase in a trip cost is something that people are familiar with because of changes in gas prices or other things that can cause recreation trip costs to change over time. And so researchers consider that a neutral and familiar payment vehicle. And so that's typically a good one for valuing a recreation trip. Okay, earlier on in an earlier video, we talked about the cost of trips, and we talked about entrance fees and other explicit cost. But those tend to be poor methods of payment. Okay, because just imagine if you're asked about whether you'd be willing to pay a higher entrance fee, some people may want to keep entrance fees as low as possible, and so they might say that they would not pay the fee, even though they don't, even though they would pay a higher fee for the recreation experience. So that's known as strategic behavior. Okay, so we want to try to avoid that. Okay, now question format. There's 4 types of questions that can be asked, and I'll go ahead and reveal that it's this dichotomous choice that most researchers use, although sometimes that can be extended to iterative bidding. Okay, but let's look at these other types of survey questions because these pop up every now and then in a recreation survey. So an open-ended question just asks respondents to state or to write down the highest dollar amount they would pay rather than not visit a site. Okay, an open-ended response, it's tempting to use because it's simple to ask, but it's difficult to answer. Respondents find coming up with a number to that question difficult to answer. And it's also prone to extreme responses, which might be strategic. So again, if you think that you may want to signal that you really loved your trip, you might say that this trip might cost $1 million before I would not visit this site. Okay, and there's no reason, there's no guardrails to keep people from providing an answer like that. Okay, on the other hand, it's easy to estimate average willingness to pay because you just have a column of numbers, and you can just take the mean or the median or the mode as some measure of central tendency. Okay, so here's some examples of an open-ended question or a series of questions that would lead to a willingness to pay question. And this one's open-ended. So question 1, first you elicit how much money was spent on a trip. And then you can adjust that with the number in the party that chipped in to cover those costs. And then question 3, how much did you value this trip? Was it worth more than you actually spent? And this question can be asked or it doesn't have to be asked. Okay, but question number 4 is the willingness to pay question. So assume that your trip became more expensive due perhaps to increased travel cost. And then what is the maximum you have paid for this trip rather than not visit this site? And so there's a blank and people can fill in that blank. Okay, and then an extension or a modification of an open-ended question is known as a payment card question. And here, respondents are again asked for the highest amount that they would pay rather than not visit the site, but they are provided some suggested values. So over here on the right, you see an example of a payment card for annual willingness to pay. For looking at these numbers, it might be for an environmental quality improvement at a recreation site, or just the construction of a new recreation site. But here's just a list of values, and you're told how much you pay for other publicly provided goods, and that's known as an anchored payment card. So again, this is simple to ask. It's easier to answer than open-ended because now you don't have to come up with your own number. You can just choose from this list. And what researchers have found is that the range of these numbers can influence willingness to pay, and the midpoint can influence willingness to pay. So you might look at these 4 columns of numbers and say, well, 2,000 is too high, 0 is too low. I'll pay something like 200 or 250. So the number in the middle of that range might be chosen more often than you would expect. And again, it's easy to estimate average willingness to pay. You can add up the numbers that are circled and then divide by the sample size, or you can do some other similar statistical approaches. Okay, but around about the 80s, somewhere in the 80s, the dichotomous choice question began to be favored. So with a dichotomous choice, respondents answer yes or no, okay, to whether they would pay a single dollar amount that is varied across respondents. So every survey respondent gets a different dollar amount, and they react to that dollar amount. Okay, the question is more difficult to ask because you need to be able to insert random dollar amounts into each question. Okay, and then the choice of the dollar amounts requires a little bit more effort. Okay, you want to cover the range of willingness to pay. And most times you don't know what that range would be before you do the survey. Okay, but for survey respondents, it's easier to answer than either the open-ended or payment card questions because it is just like a consumer purchase. It mimics a take it or leave it consumer purchase. So consumers are used to looking at prices and deciding whether to buy something or not. And it doesn't require consumers or survey respondents to come up with a particular value. You just need to know if the cost of the trip is $100 more, would you have taken that trip? Would you have still taken that trip, or would you have not? But then it's more difficult to estimate average willingness to pay. Okay, so here's what a dichotomous choice question might look like. So first you're asked, do you currently visit the site? So those who have visited the site are then asked, if the cost of visiting the site were Y dollars higher, would you still visit? Okay, and so this Y, that is a placeholder for a number. Okay, and here's what the responses might look like if they're graphed. And so over here on the right, we've got a elk hunting logic curve and willingness to pay. So each of these squares in this line to the left are the dollar amounts that have been asked in a question. Okay, and these are called bid amounts in the literature. So this and on the horizontal axis, we've got the probability that the survey respondent would pay the dollar amount. So 10% would pay $2,500 more for an elk hunting trip. 20% would pay $2,000 more, 30% would pay $600 more maybe, 40% would pay $350 more, and then 50% would pay $100 more. And as those dollar amounts fall, the percentage that people would pay more for the trip increase. Okay, and the area under this line, the geometric area under this line, is the willingness to pay estimate. Okay, it's more difficult to measure that, to estimate that, but it's not all that difficult to do so. Okay, and we'll talk about this double chances for trophy elk. We'll talk about that in the next video. And then finally, iterative bidding can be used to narrow down willingness to pay. So with a dichotomous choice question, all you know is whether the person is willing to pay more or less than the dollar amount. Okay, but after you get the response, you can continue to ask questions to narrow down the willingness to pay. Okay, so if the person is asked, if the survey respondent answers yes to a willingness to pay question, you can raise the dollar amount and see if they would pay that. If they say no, then you could lower the dollar amount and see if they pay the smaller amount. And you can keep doing that until you reach a small range of dollar amounts, which then would be the willingness to pay estimate would be within that range. So the question is more difficult to ask, and it is more difficult to answer than dichotomous choice because you're just answering more questions, and then as the dollar amounts get more narrow and narrower, closer and closer to what an actual willingness to pay would be, sometimes it's still difficult to make a choice. And then follow-up answers may be prone to various biases that we have run out of time to talk about what those biases are. But they're out there, and they can be serious, so willingness to pay estimates a lot of times need to be adjusted statistically.